Greetings to everyone listening, and welcome to the first stream of the Godspeek Podcast. I go by the name the Arkon, and I'm the creator of the website and this series, which I'll be hosting together with a gentleman known as The Greek. He'll be joining me shortly. This podcast is a follow-up to a previous one that was done on a sister site called Greekspeak.com, and it'll build on the subject matter that we covered in that one. I would recommend that those who haven't taken a look at Greekspeak.com should do that, since it acts as a gateway into the material that you'll find on Godspeek. This is an introductory episode where the Greek and myself will be highlighting some of the subjects that'll come up throughout the series. I can say up front that much of it is in the esoteric vein, being material that veers away from the conventional narratives that mainstream media peddles in. But it also diverges from much of the conspiracy theory talk that alternative media cares so much about. A lot of that comes out of the mouths of self-professed truthers, and a lot of it is theories. When it is truth, is often somebody parroting somebody else, so there isn't much room for them to elaborate on things when it's just conjecture or repetition. That's where this podcast will try to set itself apart by having the Greek elaborate on things he has first-hand experience with or has researched himself. With regards to the name of the website, Godspeek is just a play on the name of my other website, Greekspeak, which is named after the Greeks' unconventional way of talking about things. The purpose there was to explain things about society which are obvious but ignored, and the purpose with Godspeek, as the name suggests, is to illuminate the supernatural. So even if you find the notion of things like gods to be far-fetched, perhaps your curiosity will compel you to sit through the podcast, and you might end up taking these things more seriously as we progress. Godspeek.com has no political, religious, or corporate affiliations and is completely managed by myself. Similar to Greekspeak.com, podcast episodes will be available to download through the media tab on the website's homepage. And so that's it for the introduction. Thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this introductory episode. Hello, Greek. What's going on with you?
Okay, yeah, we are supposedly on a new project, which is an extension of another project, and let's see if we can get it going.
Yeah, I anticipate that things will go just as well as the last one. So this is a podcast that's going to be looking at the unseen realm of things, the powers, so to speak, that animate what we see around us, which often get mislabeled as superstition or secular occurrences. There's been times that we touched on that in the Greekspeak podcast, but I made an effort to stay away from it, to save it for now. And now that we've graduated to Godspeek, that's going to be the main focus. The unseen realm of spirits that influences the physical world. You talk about that a lot. What is it about? For most people, it sounds like a load of absurdities similar to religious nonsense. So why would a man of your distinction entertain such inclinations?
Well, let's just say the unseen realm, it's beyond just unseen, it's uncontemplated. Let's just say that again. It's not just unseen, it's uncontemplated, or it's not comprehended, it's not thought about. This particular realm, meaning the unseen realm, or let's just spill out and say the realm of the spirit, the realm of the gods, the realm of the supernatural, paranormal, or ultranatural, is not contemplated by the masses at large, which they don't contemplate anything anyway. But the point of saying it's not contemplated is when I say something like it's not thought of, it's unseen, or it's not contemplated, I'm actually speaking about the representatives of society, meaning the judges, the lawyers, the leaders, the doctors, the teachers, the professors, the experts, so on and so forth. Usually when you'll hear me make a comment about the masses, I'm not speaking about the billions and billions at large. I'm speaking about those that lead and guide them. So I just wanted to interject that. I try not to use a lot of theys or thems, but I feel that this needs to be addressing that fine point. Again, the multitude have no meaning whatsoever. Whatever meaning they have distilled into their lives comes from, yeah, you guessed it, their judges, attorneys, doctors, teachers, professors, and religious leaders, secular leaders, what have you. So again, when I refer to the masses, that is the definition that should be applied. So actually, what we're going to be speaking of is directing the point of view towards the higher aspect of the achievement of human society, meaning quote unquote higher, in air quotes. Those that are the teachers and those that establish the convention is what we're aiming the criticism, if there is any, towards. So without derailing the initial question, well, we can take a very short, cross-section of it. In modern quote-unquote science, they tell you that ultimately the majority of what exists is not physically perceivable, which is in also stark contrast to the invention of perceivable particles in matter to explain certain things. And that stems from an early papal bull. This can be researched. There are many papal bulls, but this is probably during the time of Luther, prior to the Gregorian papal bull, where the Vatican basically ensued its intent to take control of all things that are a matter of spirit or mind, and anything that was to be studied must have a physical, substantive, material counterpart. Otherwise, it was jurisdiction of the Vatican and not to be examined publicly or expressed publicly in any other way, and it was to be controlled by the Vatican. What I mean by that is, for example, the light phenomenon. Quote-unquote natural philosophers of the day or modern scientists cannot discuss the light phenomenon as what it is, a perturbation in the ether. They have to discuss it as a particle, so they invent a photon, F-A-U-X-T-O-N, and then they can discuss it as a particle. Electricity, which is another perturbation in the ether, cannot be discussed unless they have a corresponding particle, so they invent protons and electrons and things like that. I constantly make fun of them by repeating experiments that I've done where I've cut an electrical wire with a dustpan and magnifying glass in hand to see the electrons pouring out, and I've never seen that happen. So this let's just say, starting off, the Vatican, when I say the Vatican, it's a political institution. It has its sovereignty from, I guess, the turn of the century from Mussolini, I guess. I guess that was his job, and no one's contended it since. It is just a pariah in humanity, just like any other aspect of mind control would be. You could look at what the intelligence agencies have been doing through years, or quote unquote certain despotic governments, despotic religions, or whatever. But it is a negative. One of the negative things that has been established on the earth. And this is not, what I'm saying has nothing to do with what people believe in or their faith. It has to do with objectivity, as if you were to come and visit this planet. I'm not saying that the Vatican is the sole malevolent force or dictatorial force within the context of what is real and what is not, or the unseen versus the seen. There are many others. But it's the easiest one to show historically and geographically in a way that it is a political body, and most people just focus on what's called politically correct. So it is not politically correct to actually even ensue that the Vatican is wrong, makes it wrong in itself.
So you contrasted a bit the material versus the immaterial. And I think we can say that we live in a world where people are conditioned to place the most faith in the things that they can rationalize by way of their senses. And so the physical world creates the boundaries for most people's perception. What would you say is the reason behind the disparity between the physical world, where academia says that natural processes run on autopilot, and the unseen realm, where those processes are powered by an invisible sentient component?
Well, that's difficult to answer directly, because what is actually the source of the power? The power is the exhibition of work and manifestation of movement in the material world, is always an immaterial aspect. Let's take heat, light, electricity, magnetism. Those are not material components, solely material components in the material world. These are things that are put in motion and affect the material world, whose source of energy, let's just use that point, or that term, is immaterial. If you want to discuss what fields are, if you want to discuss space versus counter space, which is a negative space, there tends to be a lot of allusion to that in science fiction. You can understand when you say the mind, right? On a more advanced, let's say, discussion, one can delve into neuropathy, neurology, and the study of the brain. And it's ultimately been concluded that the brain is just a sensory organ that mediates thought and mediates mind power, or mediates what we'll find out later, or maybe in this discussion, what we say spirit is actually mind. It's the character of it when we impose it upon a living being. And then just like putting a ladle or a bucket into an ocean and removing some water, there is a larger body, a spirit, a spiritual realm, where all of these minds would be tapping into. So we'll be perhaps developing that in the future. But I don't see that what people are perceiving to be purely physical to be so at all, because you often hear people saying, oh, those are photons. And again, when I say people, not the commoners, I'm talking about the professors, scientists, philosophers, leaders in those fields. When they say photons, their experiments tend to work out, but the actual photon itself doesn't exist, you see.
I do think that that's a point of incredulity for a lot of people, that, well, you're saying that these things are fake, that they don't exist, but we have material benefits from what these scientists claim to be doing and in their labs. So that the finality of that result is clearly a testament to its validity, as opposed to what you're saying, which is really what can't be proven.
Well, people again have the perception of we're actually benefiting from what they're doing. And that's maybe another discussion, but if you objectify it, I haven't seen many benefits. I've seen slight improvements in applications of certain technologies, but essentially they are still producing and purveying entropic systems, which is the opposite of life-giving. So even if we stick with the matter of light, it's not. It is forms of light that require power sources that decay and degrade, give off heat. Where things that are living, even if you were to expand that things that are living statement into the motion of the planets and the stars, they tend to be in a harmonic balance that do not seem to be expending themselves and maintain their accuracy of movement, where what they're purveying does not.
Yeah, that I understand. But to the human being who doesn't sort of understand the back end of his own technology and is only looking at the utilitarian sort of function of it, they would say that their smartphones and their cars and their whatever are performing a function that is usable, and that is certainly an advantage over what existed, say, 100, 200 years ago, and we should thank the scientists for that. So what are you on about with your photons are fake stuff, when clearly we have our goods and services?
Sure, you can go into many aspects of that. What caused the footprint in the sand on the beach, or what caused the tree to fall. There's many, there are many ways you could say, causality. Yeah. So ultimately, the products that we, let's say, quote unquote, let's say in this case, the society at large receives from them, they perceive them as being beneficial because they offer more comfort than the previous technology did. So it's very relative in that sense.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. Well, let's say that you're on a train somewhere and the driver announces that you'll be stuck in place for the next 20 minutes because of an accident. And so to pass time, the guy sitting next to you asks if you're religious, you say no, and then that starts a conversation on what each of your convictions are concerning the non-material existence. How would you, in a situation like that, expound on the supernatural to somebody with no direct knowledge of it, but wants to learn?
Wow, that would be a big question. And the first thing I would address to that is wants to learn. Then the wants to learn needs to be held almost separate from the category and the subject matter itself, because it would not just be around, let's say, quote unquote, spirituality or religion, but it would be about anything. And at that point, let's say I was in a situation like you just mentioned, that setting, that first of all, let's be real. The chances of running into someone like that in the society is in the 1 in a million to 1 in 10 million. So let's just say we could skip this question because that wouldn't happen. It's so slim. But let's say we don't skip the question and we stick with it. I would give him a standard load of Greek speak. Basically, no one is paying attention to the obvious. And if you can perceive the obvious, which is an astounding feat on its own, then we could probably have a palpable discussion in the quote unquote spirituality, non-perceivable, ultimately called religious discussion.
Okay. I guess my thought behind the question is that most people can relate to some sensibility that indicates that the supernatural exists. They just aren't able to rationalize it or create a usable framework around it, so it just remains in the category of woo and, stays in limbo, and they can't really form a proper conclusion about it. So in that case, is there anything that a person could say to offer up, some kind of advice to point people in the right direction?
High level of discernment. You're going to have to look at the source and see if the source can be objectified. What I mean by that is, in any field of study, whatever subject or object you want to study, the reality of that can be replaced with a fiction that appears to be, or a counterfeit situation, or a contrived situation, or a contrived object that might be like the original. So you're going to have to pretty much put on some objectivity glasses and see if that source is known, not whether 50% is true, 50% is not, because in this day and age, meaning the past 150 years, when you hear of an untrusted source, it's all of their stuff is not to be trusted. It's that bad right now. Like if you hear anything from let's say what's called a multinational corporation or a government or a religious authority, it's about 99.99999% false. Everything that they're saying is kind of like the earth is known to be a purveyor of BS. One can say that being very critical, if you can get past the hurdle of perceiving the obvious, you could probably move further on that.
Okay. Let's break down some of the aspects of how people interact with the unseen world. I think the most notable way is through religion, so we can start with that. As someone who wasn't indoctrinated into any religion, what notions of the unseen realm did you carry about in your early life, and how did those ideas play out as you got older?
Okay, well, that's a very large question, because how does the unseen world interact with anyone is if anyone can structure a thought and walk across the room at the same time, that is because you're a multilateral feedback. You're actually transmitting and receiving from your environment, meaning the unseen environment. That's what consciousness is. You're not self-contained. Your thoughts are attached to a large network, let's say. This has already been established, but it's not as acknowledged as it could be or should be. And myself personally, I grew up in a Greek Orthodox Christian setting, and I knew there was something just downright wrong with it. It was not only wrong, but it was dirty. It was dark. It was, I wouldn't say evil, because they did give away food to the poor, but in essence, I had to be bribed with jelly donuts to go to church, right? Until I just said no more. And I would actually run away on Saturday night. I'd come back till Sunday night to avoid that. After enough familial embarrassment of that, they said, okay, you don't have to go anymore. And that was just really a good way. So actionable protest does work, I guess, when you're about 6 or 7.
No, that's smart. I wish I'd have thought of that. Well, no, I wouldn't have been allowed to get away with it. So I guess people are more accepting 50, 40 years ago.
Not really. I mean, I had a broomstick broken on me several times, so no, I accepted that over the other, yes.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I mean, in the absence of religion, it leaves some people wondering how they can affirm the existence of the unseen realm, because even though we can talk about your thoughts and how they're powered, most people aren't aware of that sort of thing. They take it for granted that the brain is the seat of the mind. So without religion, they're sort of left in limbo. So what is your average person to do other than join a religion or the occult if he wants to understand the supernatural?
The average person is just that. They're just doorstops. They have no play, believe it or not, in the larger scheme of things, until the larger scheme of things changes to accept them, which is not in this life. So again, most of this conversation, when we say people, will be focused towards the leadership of these doorstops, let's just say. One thing I do agree with, the power brokers of the world and those that control the world, they call them useless eaters or whatever. I fully agree with that. So the average people are just, I've defined in other sonics as space heaters. They take up space and give off heat. And I'm not just saying this again to just skirt around the question, but they're just space heaters. They're just pawns, let's just say. But what happens with this disposable mass is the leadership can guide them. So it's like you're swimming in a lake and here comes, these senseless logs, down the lake, and they're going to crush you, right? And one you can avoid, but if you have, a barrage of, a major log jam that just led through the lake, it will destroy you. They are formidable in when they're amassed together to work in a particular direction. But for them to function individually, it's negligible. That's why, for example, you have the quote-unquote intelligentsia of this in the society. It's always just a handful. You have the spiritual people, just a handful, and so on and so forth. But you know what? The real ones are not known. They always there will always be a time period when there is a resurgence of intelligentsia or spirituality or romance in art or whatever. And very often the ones that are genuinely with authentic creativity and genuine drive to advance those areas are hidden, and the fakes, and like your Einsteins and the Osama bin Ladens and the Oswalds and all the fake stuff that you see, George Washingtons, all these things that are put in front of you as being notable are not actually at all, and the real ones are kept back. So if you are amongst the average space heaters, and you one day are turned on to do great things, because it might be later on in your life, if not early in your life, you must understand that notoriety and fame is not what real people, quote unquote, or genuine performers get. They always put in front the faux aspect.
Yeah, I don't mean, I'm obviously going to desist from referring too much to the average person, because it's clearly a point of distaste. But I'm just talking about to whomever it may concern that qualifies. So if there's some princess somewhere, the Princess of Spain or whatever, that decides that she wants to understand the supernatural because she realizes that the whole monarchy is just full of idiots,
Okay.
what's she going to do?
Okay, and even then, if she really was the Princess of Spain, she would have been eliminated, and they would put a fake in her place. This is just the real reality. Is how it works. But let's say she is in that position, even if she is not really the Princess of Spain, the heir apparent. What is she to do? Back in the days when you lied to nobility, your head was cut off. I think for her to go to all of the academics and have most of their heads cut off would be a little too drastic. So short of that, it would be that she would have to have her own personal revelation of observing the obvious before she embarks on any study of any subject, whether it's medical, her body, the natural world at large, the study of the gods or spirituality or religion, the study of history. She would have to learn to discern what's being put in front and see what's false and what's not, and begin to acknowledge the obvious and ask the proper questions. So the subject matter, again, is irrelevant.
Okay, I hear what you mean. I have noticed that a number of Abrahamic religions place quite a lot of emphasis on belief as a key component in their doctrines, or at least in their traditions. I'd say evangelical Christianity takes a lot of blame pie for that today, because their refrain is just believe and you're saved, and it's all done by grace, blah, blah. But the further back in history you go, the more you see that what is called religion was about a way of life and rituals. So if you do ABC, then your God accepts you. If you don't, then there's consequences. Can you elaborate on how tenuous this idea of belief is, and the sort of distorting effect it's had on how people interact with the supernatural?
Well, if someone just tells you have to believe, it's a scam, because even if you study the famous New Testament documents that are put out that people say this concept is based on, it doesn't say anything like that at all in its entirety. One big popular thing, as they say, is the law has been done away with that you find in the Old Testament. But the most prominent day that the quote-unquote the disciples and apostles experienced was what's what they call the day of Pentecost. If they weren't following the law, that they would not have been in one place to receive what they call the Holy Spirit. You see, so also there is no. I would probably will be repeating myself very often on this. I'm not saying you shouldn't use it because it's a good target phrase, and the phrase is Abrahamic religions. There's no such thing. That is another a sign of guiding the mind down a path that isn't so. What I mean by that is if you read let's say when you say Abraham, that's a biblical text. It's also in the Quran. But if you understand the text and you read it with comprehension, you have man's society on the earth interacting with gods, but there's one God that doesn't have any people that really have an allegiance to him from a familial to a national level. So he chooses Abraham to be the man that will start the genealogy of a group of people from a familial, tribal to national and then worldwide level that will have allegiance to this particular God, who is the God of gods in the Bible. So there is no religious aspect there as much as it's a particular people have allegiance to a particular God. And I don't see that really as being a religious thing as much as it is a hereditary thing and more of establishing a nation that is known to have an allegiance to a certain God. Just like, for example, people have an allegiance to a certain leader or a monarchy. It's always known that people, even today, have an allegiance to a certain deity. And this particular deity did not have a group of people, so he created them through Abraham. So when you say Abrahamic religion, I don't see it in the way that people use religion in religious studies in what they call theocracy or theology or whatever in that sense at all.
I understand, and I do occasionally make myself guilty to sort of commonplace phrases that most people understand. We are talking about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism.
Yes. Well, belief is, you'll see colloquially, it means like lunchtime's over, get back to work. That's all it means. In other words, just say you believe and get back to what you were doing. Because if you were to do the opposite, to know, well, how much time does it take to gain knowledge versus how much time does it take to vow your belief into something? For example, it's very easy to, if you have a fake diamond that looks like the real thing, you want to find someone who's looking to buy a diamond because you could purvey the sale quicker than convincing just some pedestrian who doesn't think about buying diamonds to buy one, you see. So you have to find a willing victim. But also the consequences, which are coming in the future in this society, is when you find a willing victim and you victimize them and through the corruption of the sale of a corrupt item, the penalties and the fervor and the pursuit of getting the assailant is much higher than just a common pedestrian who was not interested in it, who would have a higher chance of chalking it off as just a misfortunate incident, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. So you mean the consequences are going to be quite dire in the future?
Sure. So what I'm trying to say indirectly, I'll be more direct, is as we progress along this path, it's not just the Greek or the Godspeek that we're doing. Society at large is going to start looking for spiritual answers. And that is the biggest threat to the current theocracies, of every religion. So every religion has its central point of focus. You might say Judaism would be out of Israel, the Roman Catholics out of the Vatican, the Mormons out of Utah, whatever. You'll see, Mecca for, these other guys, and, this shrine here for these other. Okay, the people are just casually going along because if you don't have a religion, well, there's something wrong with you, So uh, when the people start to develop a desire to learn more about it, that is the biggest enemy and the biggest threat model to these leaders of all of these different groups that I mentioned geographically, because they're not very difficult to be found out as frauds, right? I mean, anyone that wants to see what Judaism is doing as a fraud can just spend 15 minutes researching on the internet. If anyone wants to see what Christianity is purveying as a fraud, you can just spend 5 minutes on the internet. The same with Islam, the same with Hinduism, the same with any of these religions. So again, going back to the people just being worthless, is that they're not even spending 15 minutes in their life to see that the religion that they actually profess to believe in is a complete fraud. So what will happen in the near future, meaning the next few years, beginning, is people's genuine desire to gain knowledge and not completely shed belief, but shed leaning on belief as the only causality for them to profess that they are of a particular religious group. And when they have a desire to gain knowledge, all of the current systems will be shown to be complete, hoaxes and frauds. And that will be, this is actually prophetic in all of the prophetic writs of every culture. There'll be a short time when there's a turnaround in people's minds. So all of these, rabbis, ministers, imams, or whatever, if you hear this, you only have a few years. You should have an alternative occupation prepared.
Well, if we presume that the three major religions at least fall apart under scrutiny, then why not give preference to some of the Eastern ones like Taoism or Confucianism or Buddhism that are noticeably branded as more sublime and philosophical?
The same. They're the same frauds. In other words, it's as if I went and got a chicken and wrapped it with a wrapper that said bubblegum on it, and everyone's passing it around as bubblegum for a few days until it starts to really stink, and they open the wrapper and they see that it's a rotten piece of chicken inside, right? So, and even if someone wanted to open the wrapper, it says bubblegum, but it's a piece of chicken. This is not bubblegum, this is chicken, right? It's very easy to do. The wrapping and the superficial, aspect of it is very, that's what, you see, in other words, if you make something so obviously fraudulent and put it in front of people and they accept it, what does that say about those that accept it? If you have beings that are so obviously susceptible to such superficial deception, you don't have a quality being or a quality mindset that you're dealing with. And after thousands of years of this, it's like shooting fish in the barrel. It gets pretty boring, and they just continue doing it anyway, meaning the leadership.
Well, I mean, we're definitely going to take some time to look more narrowly at certain of these religions in the future episodes. But for now, let's move on to talk about what supposedly underpins the power of these religions and also secret societies and cults, which is namely the gods. I think it's arguably the least understood notion in any language or culture, with perhaps an exception of some indigenous ones. What are we to make of that word and its origins?
Oh, if you were, let's say, in Northern Europe 500 years ago and you said that word, they'd point at the sun. God, let's say you'd spell it G-O-T-T or G-O-D-T. It's an English word. Many other languages, like let's say the other common one that the prefix is used academically is theos, where you get theosophy, theocracy, theology from. Other languages, Allah in Arabic, El-Allah, Elohim in Hebrew, Brahma in the Hindu. It's just a point of reference. It usually, in every culture, if you use the corresponding term for that, they usually point up.
Why do they tend to point upwards? Because I mean, you can identify gods even on the ground level.
Yes, but generally that's the consensus of where everything comes from. Even from the scientism, the religion of modern science, they tell you everything came from the stars. Now not evolution where you formed as slime in the water and then developed legs and crawled on the surface. So that's still the pregenesis to that is astral, meaning up high.
Okay. You've often talked about how the physical world is subordinate to the spiritual world, and the quality and quantity of things here can be used to infer a lot about the other side. So, what can we surmise about the gods and their society by drawing parallels between the physical and the spiritual domains?
If you look at it from an industrial manufacturing point of view, uh, the sheer similarity of all things biological. You know how you hear, for example, of DNA, right? You notice as time goes on, there's less talk about that because it's such an inaccurate science. There's 111 comparisons. You can have a long discussion or a study on your own. And of course, like the study of DNA now just ends up in the legal society, which is all presumption and fiction anyway. And you always hear about someone being convicted or acquitted based on DNA. And if you look at how they're using it, it's completely against the accepted methods. Because the I think I've discussed before, again, the attorneys are represent certain forces. But if you look at what they call DNA, broccoli has about 70 or 80% of human DNA. A housefly is about 90% human DNA. So we're looking at several, let's say, aspects of the biological code that all share the same thing, almost identical, when you're looking at the percentages of how similar they are. Things that most living things require light. Most living things require aspiration to breathe and food. So you look at the mechanism of nature itself, from the law of the jungle all the way to the finest scrutiny and objectifying what to be alive is, and then seeing that there's actually a consciousness behind it that's driving it, right? And what even plants, the secret life of plants, anyone could look that up. Fellow wrote a book about how plants were set up to electrical sensing devices, and they reacted to human emotion and movement.
There's also this aspect of the gods having become a very sparse field of expertise, and I want to look at that also. And I don't mean knowledge of ancient religions, which I think there's just still quite a bit of information about. I mean the equivalent of what we see in indigenous cultures, where in places like Vietnam or Cambodia, when the witch doctor says, don't go into the house over there because there's an evil spirit inside, and if you go anyway, as soon as you step into the living room, you feel someone punch you in the head and knock you out, even though the house was empty. I mean, that kind of cause and effect that's closer to how technology operates. Where did that knowledge of the gods disappear to?
The overarching, what I call contractual discoveries that were made after the Renaissance. When you hear about contractual discovery, that is when you hear of the explorers that were sent out throughout the world that were also followed by the let's say special forces to gather and acquire all this information, like the witch doctor says don't go into this house or the forest or what have you. When these discoverers went out, you hear of all the explorers, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, Columbus, all the soon to follow were the special forces of the Vatican and other groups that knew of this existence as a part of the normalcy of the society, acquired the information, and not only of the happenings, but also how to control and manipulate and interact with these forces, and then of course eliminate the people that did have control and then take control of it and sequester it. If you go to places in the Congo, Somalia, parts of Afghanistan, parts of southern Libya, where you don't have this contractual overarching, quote unquote, the modern system that you see on the planet, the people are quite familiar with this, and they're still quite active with it, especially in many of the jungle regions.
Okay, I mean that's a good segue into sort of the next question. If to some extent indigenous cultures were able to retain that knowledge, then I wonder why those people have been so ineffective in shaping world events, and not only that, but even in deciding their own fate as nations. I mean, if you look at the Native Americans as an example, here we have a group of people who occupied probably one of the most coveted land areas that I've seen outside of Syria, Palestine, maybe. They had access to occulted knowledge, such as incantations and conjurations, that could have easily wiped out the Europeans that invaded, yet they lost their land and now they're almost extinct. And so now the story is that the supremacy of Western European culture and weaponry triumphed over backwater Indians who wasted their time praying to a totem pole. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah. Why? Yeah. In other words, what are the benefits of that? Let's say they were doing more than the totem pole. The totem pole would be more like the like a divine geographical marker, just like you would have a marker for any other purpose on the earth itself. Uh, I wouldn't say they were just praying to it. I think it was more of a marker, like a survey point. But I would suggest that there was enough wisdom within those cultures to understand that an evil force was going to come to their society. And that evil force was not a monolithic evil force acting on its own volition, but part of the great grand cycle where an evil force has to come, or it's inevitable that will come in order for this cycle to end and go to the next cycle, meaning cosmic cycle.
Okay. I mean, that does carry a sense of resignation, though. I mean, they did fight.
Yes.
They did fight, though.
The ones that lacked wisdom mostly did, yes. And there were conscientious objectors, by the way, let's just say, about fighting. It was just submit, because in other words, the ones that had wisdom and really had true spiritual knowledge did not mind perishing, because they understood that the overarching force and overarching inevitability of the end of the age happening a certain way, it cannot be changed. So why fight it?
Oh, okay. I've never heard much about that. I'm gonna have to go looking for those accounts because I don't see much about it. I mean, obviously the Native Americans, a lot of them are mixed race now, so you don't find that knowledge base being what it used to be, but
There was much written about this in the 19th century, but by the turn of the 20th century up until the 1930s, what was written about it was sequestered and taken away. All that remains are things that you might find in some library or some reference that you can, digital or not, that is a second or let's say tertiary account of there existing at one point a body of knowledge recording these things, but we don't know where it is or it's not available anymore. There's going to be a revival of this, by the way, and there's an attempted revival, albeit by the visually impaired. When I mean visually impaired, meaning spiritually, having sight, eyes to see means the spiritual things. Most of the people that are trying to revive, quote unquote, through the New Age and many other aspects of every culture, by the way, whether it's the indigenous people or the Westerners, they're trying to revive some kind of spirituality, but they're impaired. They don't understand the fundamentals, so they're not going to succeed until the time allows them to.
another realm in which the supernatural is often invoked is that of the occult, which oddly has remained something that people meddle with at night in a basement or an attic or in a forest or a parking lot rather than out in the open. Why do you think none of the occult societies have been able to pierce the veil of secular culture to take charge of man's society if the power behind them is real?
Oh no, they have. They have completely. When you see something on television, an event, whether it's an assassination, a terrorist event, or a pandemic or whatever, that is completely fabricated, and everyone believes it wholeheartedly, that there was a tremendous amount of ritual that had gone on before that to put out enough influence in that realm to influence the individuals.
Oh,
Pharmaceutical companies do it. If you know anyone that's in not low level but higher level pharmaceutical business, all of it is done by occult ritual. Yeah, there's not much to hide on that. This is right now current events. There's something about a vaccine being put out, and they're waiting until a certain time when the stars are in place. They're telling you. This is in the current events right now.
yeah, I guess I'm referring to more this idea that even within the secret societies, if you want to talk Freemasons or Jesuits or whatever, the more forward-facing ones, there's a sense in which it doesn't seem like they really know what they're doing because you can run into people who belong to those societies and they don't really know what the future holds. They know that there's something that the higher ups are doing right now, perhaps, but it almost feels like they're fumbling around in the dark still.
Well, the current, when you say any of these societies that you might find on, let's say, MapQuest or Google Maps, where you see they have a building or a society or a website, those are the common morons that get together, do fancy handshakes, get photographs, eating pork and wearing an apron or whatever. And it doesn't matter which culture you're talking about. By the way, all cultures have a Freemasonic order of some sort, or Templar order, or some kind of rites. And I say rites, R-I-T-E-S is the spelling. But those are the common morons, and the only reason those exist openly is because years ago, when the population was smaller and those organizations were still publicly visible, they were more hardcore. But as populations expanded, so let's say we go back 1,000 years, and we see that there's a group of Freemasons in a particular country, there's 500 of them, the population expands and grows, and descendants of those Freemasons decide to be in Freemasonry. Now the population, instead of being just 500 or so Freemasons, is 20,000, right? Well, there's still only 500 that know what's going on, and the other 19,500 are just filler. It's the same with the military and the same with the police. You know, when you look at the military, they're grunts. You know, if there's 1 million people in the military, there's fewer than 1,000 or 2,000 of them that know what they're doing. The rest are just filler bodies, you know, masses, like I said earlier. The label is still valid. And in other words, the secret societies, their labels are still valid. If you go look at, for example, the Facebook logo is a Freemasonic logo that's been used for a long time. It means a certain thing. The Gmail is a Freemasonic apron. They're still, would you say, well, this is the free? No, they're just putting this. The symbolism is showing you that it still has viability. It's just that you can't put your hand on it.
And that, I guess, is also a good sort of segue into another question, because there's this odd cat and mouse game that these societies and occult groups play with the public, where corporate names and logos clearly indicate that the corporation is operating in honor of or under the auspices of a deity, to the point where, for example, anybody can see that the Mazda car is named after Ahura Mazda, the chief Zoroastrian deity, or that Nike is named after a Greek goddess. But if you ask the CEO, they'll just deny it. And so my question is, why such a seemingly spineless way of ruling the world, where you have to hide behind plausible deniability, when we know that high-level corporations and governments utilize occult practices?
Oh, well, the CEOs are just ceremonial figureheads. Again, I mentioned recently, when the mob got into white-collar crime, they needed shell corporations, you know, corporations to achieve a certain thing in commercially or in trade and then collapse it. And they're like, well, we need a CEO. I said, well, just get that homeless guy there to sign, get him a new suit, a shave, send him to a spa, and have him sign papers. Doesn't matter. You'd have to be insane to be a rational, if you had the slightest amount of honor, dignity, lawfulness, and morality, to be a CEO of one of these big companies. They don't pick people that are, and those companies come before the people. So when you hear about like Jeff Bezos did Amazon, he didn't do, or that guy that did Facebook or whatever, he didn't do anything. They just put some clown there. They're guided. It's very simple. It's to do. It's just that you don't get the story because it's obvious. I mean, not you, but you know, people don't get it because it's just so obvious.
I hear the pay's good, though.
Well, the bank numbers.
Yeah.
I have from a good source, the guy, the bozo guy, when he's given a certain agenda and he has to think, he reports back, he's not sure about it, he may not want to do it. Well, the next time he goes and checks his bank balance, it's 0.00. And they know he just checked his bank balance, so he gets the phone call again, and he says, would you reconsider? And he says, I'll reconsider. So he goes back and checks his bank balance, and it's 50 billion. So you really want, and all of these people that you hear that are wealthy or not, in Hollywood and music and industry, the moment they say, I want to get out of this, the moment they see that he's purchasing survival equipment or a place that's not on Google Maps, let's say, or a travel to bug out, or a appointment with plastic surgeons and all that, he gets a phone call. He says, your funds are taken away from you again. What do you think you're doing? You're in this for life. They have no money. So when you see these people in the music industry in Hollywood, they allude to this. There's plenty of YouTube videos of Jim Carrey saying, I don't know what I did, you know, and other actors publicly saying, this is not what you think it is, you know. Jim Carrey wants to get away from being anally raped or whatever by Hollywood, you know, people who control Hollywood. He can't. Well, he could do it. He'd be homeless. He would be penniless. And the moment he asked someone for money, they'd put him in an insane asylum. The Kanye West guy that went crazy at a concert talking about Illuminati, he's hospitalized for 3 days and he comes out and he's totally fine. These people have no money. Prince has tried it to get away from it. And you can't. Nobody can get away from it once you get into it that deep, meaning on a worldwide fame level. Any of these guys. Bill Gates wants to get away with his husband, or I'm sorry, his wife, Melinda. When Bill Gates wants to get away and wash his hands of it, he'll be a pauper or put in an insane asylum. He has no money at all. They have no money. It's all bank numbers. This is the biggest fallacy. If you understand the Kali Yuga, it says in the end, people will only listen to people who are wealthy, and they're not even wealthy. It's just a double irony here. And by the way, if you're a real wealthy person, you don't put your money in the bank because they're only insured for 100,000 quid or whatever, right? Or dollars.
That's true.
You don't have to go to Harvard Business School to know that you can only get $100,000 return on your $1 billion parking $1 billion somewhere. You can only come back and get 100,000 out of it. You don't have to go to Harvard Business School to know that's a bad move. The wealthy people don't have to put their monies in these institutions. But I wanted to go back to like the Hollywood people and the famous people, Bill Gates and the Jeff Bezos and Kanye West and Prince and whatever, Jay-Z. They could go out and buy an airplane. And Jim Carrey, they could go out and buy 10 Ferraris because that fits the role that they're playing. They could go out and buy a big house. Right? How many times have you heard some actors, especially as this happened with some basketball and sports people recently, they wanted to sell their $5 million mansion, but then it gets foreclosed on? How's that possible? Because it's like, stop your movements. If you keep persisting, your car will explode because it crashed into a gum wrapper. You crashed into a paper cup and the car exploded. Or your helicopter goes down, or you drown. This is not what people think it is. None of these people that you know or hear have any power. They're all just a show. It's very efficient for the powers that are behind the scenes, meaning the secret societies and the spirits that they deal with, to put this charade in front of society. It's very efficient. Because right now, I even had someone says, Greek, I want to live with honor, lawfulness, and dignity. I want to go after these powers. Like, who? Where are you going to aim? Who? You can't identify them. They spent the past 1,000 years cloaking themselves. You can't find them. There is no way to revolt or repel this. This goes back to the wisdom of those native people that allowed themselves to be exterminated because they knew that this had to happen anyway. No matter what you did, it was going to happen. Because it was the ages, the progression of the cosmic ages is far more significant than you living another day to wipe your bum or get hungry or have more children. And the essence of your spirit and the true motive for you existing is beyond what you see in this current age.
Yeah, well, we're going to get into more of that as things go on, and I think that'll be a pleasure because there's a lot to learn in that realm of things. But let's wrap up the podcast by looking at the topic of ancient culture, although we've touched on it a little bit already. So what we know about the gods comes to us from memorialized accounts over the past 4,000 to 5,000 years, but since the Middle Ages, the volume of those writings either declined or became very occultic and hidden. So the most direct literature about the gods is from classical antiquity, most of it. What can this period teach us about the gods in ways that seem to vanish once the Dark Ages arrive?
Well, there were no Dark Ages until the Middle Ages. Everything was just fine. It was just to redefine it's dark not because it was dark in any way, other than we don't know much. The information has been sequestered. And the information just lets you know that you're getting closer to the end of the age. Every culture has in its own prophetic writings that as we get closer to the end of this age, meaning grand age, not just cycle of ages where you have, let's say, cycles of 2,000 or consecutive series of, let's say, 1,000 or 2,000 years, but a grand age, which could be 7 or 20 or 24,000 or 14,000 years, but most likely, let's just say, in the multiple thousands of years, all the cultures have in their similarity is that there will be an unprecedented peak in malevolency, lack of honor, lack of dignity, lack of lawfulness in the end of the grand age. Very much described as you see now. And this could be said in an objective way, or it could be said in a subjective way, where I like to say that if you preach doom and gloom and evil and malevolency any time in human history, it sounds about right. But never has it been on a, as we know, Dark Ages aside, on such a level where it's pretty much the entire world.
You and I were having a conversation some time back, it's probably some years ago, and you said something interesting about ancient writs. You asked me, why do you have to pick ancient literature as a reference point for understanding reality? And naturally, I couldn't answer at the time, so you just answered it yourself, and you said, because why would you refer to a book that came into existence only a few hundred years ago when you have books from thousands of years ago? And books from the 18th century probably won't have much to offer about 6,000 years of human civilization. Could you elaborate on that more about this idea of first in time is first in line and the primacy of ancient recordings?
Sure, the primacy, meaning taking it from a point of hysteresis, where the older the better, when you focus on what's older, what came first. Is not necessarily that it's in a book. It could be something that's scribbled on the side of a stone. It's a communication. It's memorializing a communication. For example, we have the gods have an active role with humanity via communication. If you were just to narrow it down as a phenomenon, why do we have people imagining things about another race of beings known as the gods, and that they received script from them, or directions to write script from them and writs from them? Is it purely imaginative? And even if it was purely imaginative, let's say from a romantic fictional point of view, why are they all so similar? And even that becomes the notion that it's just people's imagination becomes self-defeatist, because the accuracy and the similarity and the causality, that we see in history. In other words, when you read about Sodom and Gomorrah, it's a real place. When you read about the Temple of Solomon, it's a real place. When you read about, or other things, these are real places. How can the imagination be stretched so far? It must be there must be a concurrent line of fact underneath all of it. So all we have from the gods, other than the substantive reality that all things seem to be made by them, or a similar manufacture or similar creation and formation, that there is a separate aspect to the gods interacting with us through communications. You want to call them prophets, sages, messiahs, angels, when you get into demons, when you get into the non-corporal again, that there's so much of it, that just because there's so much quantity doesn't mean it's valid, but the quality of the information makes it valid, not just the quantity. So in other words, everywhere you look, there is some reference to some god everywhere, somewhere and everywhere. If we take those either as valid or invalid from being from the gods, you always end up at the same place qualitatively, that they're all higher order dictates, memorializations, memorializations of higher order communications, not just to the people at the time, but to be sent through the future. The most viable ones, obviously, are the ones written in stone, because they don't decay. Even, for example, finding ancient scrolls, there are many challenges, let's say in the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls, right? There are major challenges I don't need to discuss with finding 2,000-year-old scrolls. Right? They don't seem to be very durable. But when you have something carved into the side of a stone, it tends to have more durability. And whether it's on a more recent find, let's say the scrolls in Qumran, or ancient stelae that have been carved, or even oral tradition and folklore that has survived to a certain degree, it all needs to be looked at, and when it's looked at, it all has the same qualitative meaning, which I think validates the existence of the gods in itself, the communication that's been memorialized.
Okay, but we can't overlook that among ancient texts, we have the Greek text competing with the Egyptian text, competing with the Parthians, competing with the Israelites, competing with the Sumerians, Babylonians, blah, blah, blah. And they all claim preeminence, or at least most of them do. So what do we make of that order?
They do and they don't. Even if you look at the lowest level presentations of whether it's the Catholic, what the Catholics tell you you go through when you die, the ancient Greeks tell you what you go through when you die, or the Parthians, or so forth. They're all similar and almost identical when you look at the technique, not identical in technique, but identical in process. Like, for example, the man on the street thinks you're good, you go to heaven, you're bad, you go to hell forever. But if you study Catholic purgatory, you go there until you have worked through all of your bad stuff, and then you go to the next level. You come out of it. And the man on the street, the typical Catholic, doesn't know that because he works on belief. He hasn't spent 15 minutes studying what the doctrine that the institution that he's pledged allegiance to is purveying. And it's not encouraged, of course. It's just like if you meet an attorney and not a paralegal who does all the work, but you go to his house or his office, you look at all the law books, they're all brand new. They're 40 years old and they've never been touched. He doesn't go by those. And the moment you suggest that we look there, they get very offended because his job is to manage your stupidity, right? Same with a doctor. His job is to manage your stupidity. A priest, a minister, a pastor, an imam is to manage your stupidity. They're not there to educate you or educate themselves. And if you got rid of them, the people would say, well, we don't have any more attorneys. Let's make some more. Let's put some more in there. They don't have to do anything. They just have to give us the perception that they do. We don't have any more ministers or priests or pastors, right? Or rabbis or imams. Let's make some more. You right here. Yeah, put this on. You're a priest. Go. Just tell people this right here is a little crib sheet, 5 things, and you're done. They feel like these things. Give you an example. Like if you understand, I don't know if you know anyone in the Secret Service, and they have their opinions about, the United States, who's president, but even the Secret Service itself, the training that they put their agents through to protect the president is you're not protecting the man itself, you're protecting the office of the presidency, you see. It's the office of the rabbi, the office of the attorney, the office of the doctor, right? The office of this, it's not the, so now we've lost, it's all become just hollow shells, right? Hollow, it's just, someone has to fill it, it doesn't matter. It's kind of like when you read about the post-Maccabean or Maccabean era in the temple in Jerusalem, they were such a defeated people, they just took some young Syrian boy and put him in priestly garments, says, you're the high priest. Yeah, you could just get somebody, anyone, give him, say that he went to whatever seminary and did a couple of good things. You're the Pope. Just get up there. You're the Pope. Everybody bows down. You're the Pope. It's just the offices. They're hollow. They're the people that are in those all offices, even your local, attorney, doctor, priest, rabbi, whatever. They're just filling a position. People like them or don't like them. It doesn't matter. It's the position is there. It's all vanity, There's no substance behind and the characters. The people that take these professions, whether, again, professors, attorneys, doctors, whatever, so on, popes, they're all of poor character, by the way, if you get to know them. Judges, whatever, captains, whatever, they're all poor character. And that goes to the sublime message. The society is in such a poor state, who would want to rule over them? Who would want to be a priest or minister or a pastor of such a poor quality society? Of course, it'll have to be an individual that's even poorer than them to put up with them, you see. Any man of quality or woman of quality would never take a leadership position in this society, ever. They wouldn't last even if they tried. So you're always going to have, within the past 150 years, inferior people in superior positions and superior people in inferior positions. This is a given as another sign of, it's just vanity. It's just the time has to go through. It's like being in a dunk tank for, you agree to be in the dunk tank for 1 minute, but you can only hold your breath for 40 seconds. That's okay. You said a minute, so you got to deal with the last 20 seconds, right?
Yeah, sounds painful.
Mm-hmm. It is painful. If you're not in pain, you're not paying attention. But it doesn't mean you can't deal with it.
Okay, so yeah, I think we've looked at a variety of topics, and I think that sets the table to expand on things in subsequent episodes. I don't feel a need to over expand on anything since we'll have more things to cover in the future. Are there any other generalities you'd like to mention on the subject of the supernatural before we wrap up?
Well, just define supernatural by itself. For what people perceive to be natural, if something is extraordinary, it's supernatural. But if you have a pretty good perception of what is possible in the natural world, you may not perceive certain things as being supernatural because it's just being of the understanding of how subtle energies can manifest as big powerful forces. But generally, what we consider supernatural, quote unquote, we meaning the society at large, loosely there, is stuff that's been put in front of us as being as such, through religious doctrine and Hollywood and media and whatever. But as we progress in time, the next half a decade or so, I think there'll be some solidity to the term supernatural, paranormal, miraculous, meaning it will be experienced publicly. It'll be more active in the world.
Cool. Then I think we've covered everything that we need to cover in this introductory episode. And similar to the Greek podcast, I'll be trying to do an episode a month. We'll see how the timeline plays out. The last one took a year. I wouldn't be surprised if we had a similar timeline, but I'll shoot for less and we'll see how it goes. And so thank you to everybody who tuned into this one, and we look forward to seeing you at the next episode.